So we're going to officially get started here. I am Mary Beth Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So very pleased to see all of you here today with us in the room and on Zoom, and especially grateful to our speakers coming in their busy work lives and lives to join us and share with us a little wisdom about a topic that we have had a lot of enthusiasm about as we've led up to this session: sports, activism, and philanthropy. And we'll make some proper introductions of our speakers in a moment, and I'll let them really do most of the talking about who they are and what they do. But we're certainly going to have great expertise here with us today, representing some nearby professional sports organizations and an expert on the way that athletes are getting involved in democracy in recent years. So I want to take a moment right as we get started today. If you are not a speaker today, you could mute yourself. We would sure appreciate it. Okay, great. So if you could go ahead and advance to the next slide. So if you're not familiar with our center, we are a center here on the UW-Madison campus. We are based at the School of Human Ecology, where those of us that are in person are sitting here today. And we do community engaged teaching, research, and outreach focused on advancing the work of the civic and nonprofit sectors. And we hope after today, if we're new to you, you'll stay connected. If you have questions about the center, I'll linger around a little bit after the session today if you want to chat. And we are doing this session as a part of a consistent CommUniversity series that we offer on third Thursdays in the main months of each academic semester. So stay tuned for also a lineup of events that we have planned for March and April, and then we'll resume again in the fall. Next slide. So I mentioned that we're joined here today by some wonderful representatives of the community engaged and charitable arms of some professional sports organizations. One organization that we did invite for today was the Milwaukee Brewers organization and the Community Foundation, and the lovely Cecilia Gore had agreed to participate, but her spring training schedule in Arizona has interfered with her being here with us today. So what we're going to do is we're going to obtain a recording of an interview with her and post it later alongside the YouTube video of this session today. And I'm also going to take this moment to just say a few words about a figure in Wisconsin sports that we lost recently, Bob Uecker. I grew up in Wisconsin. I grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And for me, obtaining much of my Brewers content from the radio, Bob Uecker was a very important and consistent figure in my childhood, in my life. And I'm sure many of you here who are from Wisconsin feel the same way. I really wanted to lift up him as a person in sports as well, because as many people have said much more eloquently than me, including the Milwaukee Brewers organization, the Milwaukee Bucks posted about it. Pat Murphy in spring training this week had a beautiful video from the locker room on his comments about Bob Uecker. Christian Yelich, I mean, the young guys also posted about Bob Uecker, but Bob was a man who forewent opportunities to do more lucrative things with other organizations to stay in the community of Milwaukee. He was a voice of intelligence and humor, and he connected with people across generations and across cultures. And I know he was somebody that could speak to the issues going on in the world while keeping humor and a faith in humanity in the way that he talked about things. So to me, he was much more than a just sports broadcaster. And I think many people feel the same way. Just one example, he was a person who I learned a lot about the period of segregated baseball from, because he would talk about what it was like to be a player in that Milwaukee era that you see on the left there, when he was actually a player and traveling, and his teammates having to go to different places to spend the night when they were on the road. And so that's just one example of something that he was able to shed light on and speak to with such grace while keeping his role as a major sports broadcasting figure and using that role to, I think, lift up goodness and faith in people and connecting across generations and history and cultures. So he's a civic health hero to me. Civic health is a theme we work on at the center. And the picture on the left there is the memorial that shaped up spontaneously in the days after his passing that I made sure to stop by. And I saw lots of other loving Wisconsinites there, also celebrating his life. So thanks for taking a moment with that. And we'll be sure to post the Cecilia Gore video after today's session once we get that recorded in early March. So with no further ado, we're going to get into our discussion for today. We are joined here by Tova Wang of the Ash Center at Harvard University, Arvind Gopalratnam from the Milwaukee Bucks Foundation, Sarah Laporta from the Chicago White Sox Charities, and Bobby Joe Eisenreich from the Green Bay Packers Foundation. Speakers, forgive me if I've stumbled on the pronunciation of your names. I hope that you will correct me when you come back on if needed. I should have verified that before we started today. But we're going to have our first segment of the talk today from Tova about civic engagement and sports in recent years. But before we do that, I'm going to have everybody just say a little something about how they got into the work. So if each of you could just take a turn to say, like, how did you start getting interested in the intersection of sports and community and philanthropy or activism? And why don't we go in the order on the slide? So Tova, in a moment, you'll be sharing a lot more about your work, but for now, just how'd you get interested in this and how'd you get started working on it?
Yeah, I was going to start with that anyway. I've been working on voting rights and increasing political participation, especially among marginalized communities, for like 25 years. But more importantly, perhaps, I'm a huge sports fan. And so I have always been interested in the intersection of sports and political activism and political participation. And without giving anything much away, I will say that it's been an interesting space for the last few years.
Great, thank you. Arvind, how'd you get into this and how'd you get started?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. I got a little Wi-Fi issue, but I'm working off the phone, so it should be okay. Nice to see you all. My name's Arvind, work with the Milwaukee Bucks. I'm Senior Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility. I have loved sports my entire life. I've played sports my entire life, and that love and passion for sports connected me to the Bucks and rewarded me this opportunity that I've had the last 8 years to be ingrained in social impact work. And really, truthfully, like, it's all the engagement, the love and passion for this work is something that I didn't necessarily know I was going to end up doing as my professional career, but my professional career has allowed me to be in this space, to be engaged, to learn, to be educated. And so my passion continues to grow exponentially with each day and each month and each season and each cycle. And so I have kind of embraced this power and intersection of sports and community impact and activism, largely through my professional responsibilities, but so that I can better serve my colleagues and the community around me. It's been awesome. I love it. And I'm excited to share some of the work that we do.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. So I wish when I was a college student that people were telling me all of these great things, because I think my career path would have been very different because I didn't know this was a job. I've always been very interested in like nonprofit volunteer work, even as a kid, all the way through college, but I really was passionate about sports. So I actually started in sports journalism, but at one point in college, I was like, maybe I should go like more the nonprofit sector, like a traditional nonprofit, but I stuck with sports, started in sports television on the production side, and ran into someone in the Super Bowl of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and she said, I'm the director of community relations. And I was like, well, what is that? And at the time, this was, 20 plus years ago, she told me exactly what her job was. And I was like, that is combining all of my passions. So then here I am. I worked in minor league baseball for about 10 years for a few different teams, and I've been here with the White Sox for, this will be my 12th season. So it's just a perfect marriage of my interest in sports, my interest in giving back, and just how a sports team can really connect a community. I think is so important. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks for that heads up that you started in the minors. I don't think I knew that. And that's a really interesting piece for maybe how you could stair step a career like this. So thank you for that. Bobby Joe from the Green Bay Packers.
Well, again, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here. I started in this job a lot different than my fellow speakers did. I was actually in insurance for 17 years. And I had just had enough at that point in time. I left that job. I was unemployed for a couple of months. My husband has had a 40-year career with the Green Bay Packers. And he had told me about this position that was in community outreach for 10, 15 hours a week, fulfilling donation requests. So I applied. I didn't know if it was a good thing that he and I both worked at the same employer, but it did work out okay in the end. And I did not have a college education at that point in time. I went back to school, my bachelor's degree. I then transitioned to a full-time position. I just learned as much as I could about anything that was going on in our department, in others' departments that kind of crossed over into ours and got me to where I am today. So I've been here for, it'll be 24 years in September.
Wonderful. And a nice variety of stories here about how you got into the work, but I think the appreciation for sports is probably the binding factor. So we're going to pivot now. We are going to come back to our full panel with some discussion, with some questions that we prepared in advance. But first, we're going to go ahead and have Tova Wang share with us a little presentation on the intersection of professional sports and voting and democracy. So we're pulling up some slides that she's prepared for us, and that they should be showing momentarily. Let's see.
I'll just,
Great.
I'll start by saying that I mentioned that I am a sports fan, so that is obviously a big part of this. I don't know if the chat is open, but I have learned to not divulge the teams that I root for because I lose 90% of the audience. But I will begin by saying, so I love sports. I've been doing voting and democracy and political participation for a super long time. And then in 2020, probably in the summer-ish, I started reading stories that some of the professional sports arenas and stadiums were going to be used as polling sites that year. And I loved that idea. I thought it was amazing for all sorts of reasons. And I said to myself, you know, I wonder what the impact was of having these places as polling locations, because it's such a different experience to go to a stadium or a basketball arena that you're a fan of, where the team plays that you're a fan of, than at a school or something like that. So at that point, I got together a band of fellow travelers and started this work. So I can go to the next slide now. I think this is probably something everyone in this group agrees on, but I like to start with the premise for why I even understand there to be an intersection. Again, I think sports have superpowers. They get attention in ways that other people and other entities don't. They reach a different audience. They build community, they build common identity, and they create bonds. And obviously they're fun. And I became very, very aware of this. Well, this would be giving it away, but I'll do it anyway. Being up here in Boston now and going to a Yankees Red Sox game here at Fenway and realizing that it was probably like 40% Yankees fans. And I realized that the people in the stadium who were Yankees fans all became instant best friends. And we were all, you know, we're all high-fiving and all this kind of stuff. And they could have been mass murderers for all I knew, but that was a thing that created a bond between us. And I'll just emphasize that with a quote from Jane McManus, who some of you may know in the next slide. She's a former ESPN reporter, and I'll just read it, though you can read it yourself. But sports draw people together regardless of politics and identity. Games contain both conservative and progressive values like self-determination and equity. The very act of sitting in the stands with 80,000 of your closest friends and sharing an experience is something humans have been doing for thousands of years. This literal common ground, one of the few remaining in America, is a place where we should be having these conversations. I guess with the 80,000, she probably covered football, but in any case. So the next slide. So like I said, I got together some colleagues of mine to take a look at what the impact was of having these arenas and stadiums serve as polling sites in 2020. And you can go to the next one. And I'll just, so this is just a little bit of a teaser, but basically we did this huge study, which I'll get into the specifics of in a minute, but what we found, the big takeaways that we found were that having the polling sites in stadiums was not a partisan issue. And it was supported by people across the spectrum. Number two, that stadiums have the conditions to be effective voting locations. I can get more into this, but one obvious way is that they have a ton of parking. And that is always a huge problem for elections officials who are trying to put an election together. And another, I always refer back to this, that's one of the team executives said to me, they said, this was easy. This is what we do. We move lines, and this is no different. And so there's just all sorts of ingredients that the stadiums have that really lend themselves well to being voting locations. And as I said, it was such a good news story when we put it out, because with the one minor exception of a somewhat crabby election official, everyone we talked to, and there was a ton of people, thought it was fabulous. The elections officials were thrilled to have this huge space with very reliable electricity, which is a thing, and this place to have lines and all this kind of thing. The teams loved it. It made the staff feel good about what they were doing. And they just really enjoyed being part of the process, I think. And I think at least some people recognize that lending themselves to something that would serve the community was a way of giving back, especially given how much tax money and so on that these stadiums require to be built and maintained. So now I can go to the next one. Just a note that there's a long history going back decades of these spaces being used for civic purposes. You'll probably remember that the stadiums were also used for the COVID vaccine and for the tests. So that was just one example just before the election that they were used for. We can go to the next one. So in 2020, 48 of the major pro sports stadiums and arenas were used for early and election day voting, which is pretty amazing. So we have a couple of pictures here. Fenway, which I will confess, the Red Sox have done a great job with this. I gotta, tip my cap on that one. But in State Farm, it was phenomenal. I believe it was something like between 30 and 40,000 people voted at State Farm in Atlanta. It was the most used polling site, I think, in the state. So go to the next one, please. So the way we set out to research this, just to get into a little bit of academic speak for a second, is that we partnered, actually the University of Maryland, one of my colleagues is there. They did some national surveys, different survey experiments to see what people responded to. We did some data analysis using voting records. We looked back at some of the historical uses of these spaces. And then primarily me, did a whole ton of amazing interviews with people, both from the election administration community, from the teams, and then also civic community organizations that were involved in supporting these efforts. And I did talk to the people from the NFL and the NBA at least, but I'm trying to remember if I did with baseball, but I'm sorry, I don't remember actually. But so that was sort of how we went about this. We can go to the next one. So again, we did a public survey. As you can see here, there was tremendous amount of support for using these spaces as stadiums. We can go to the next one. And this was across party lines. So this, again, is not a partisan issue. It is supported across the political spectrum. As you can see, the very dark color at the end is very small. And so there were very few people who thought this was a bad idea. Next slide. And as I mentioned before, people loved it. I mean, people, especially, from the election administration community and from the sports world, Steve Koonin from the Hawks was a big part of putting it in motion. And they did a terrific job. And he was a really powerful part of that. Next one. So one of the things that we wanted to see is if it was just that the stadiums were convenient. And to some degree that was true. It was the people in those neighborhoods that were voting there, but we did find that some people did travel, especially to go vote in the stadium, which tells us that there was something special about doing it that way. Next slide. And then who actually voted in these places? We found that there was no partisan advantage to voting in what happened with voting in the stadiums. This just has a couple of the places here, but broadly, that is what we found, despite what might have been presupposed about it. We can go to the next one. Similarly, these are all in California, which is why they're a little skewed, I think, but broadly speaking, the racial composition varied very much by stadium, and that's probably because of where they are located and what the community is like there. But it clearly served all sorts of communities. Next one. So now we come to 2024, and it was a very different landscape. As you can see here, I don't have any pictures. From what we've been able to collect, and there could be a little bit of error in this, but what we've been able to discover is that very few stadiums were used in 2024. And either in early voting, election day, any of it, and that there was some outreach from some teams about the importance of voting and all that kind of stuff, but it definitely seemed to be ratcheted down. And even the teams that did have voting didn't really go out of their way to advertise it too much. And some of this there were legitimate reasons for, and then there are reasons I'm not clear on, but I will say that I was disappointed in 2024 that there was such a reduction. When we found even in the 2020 report that having games being played because it was during COVID in 2020 would not be a barrier or a big barrier to doing this again. And a lot of teams actually did it in 2022, and far fewer did it in 2024. Next slide. Except for the Las Vegas Raiders. The Las Vegas Raiders and the elections officials in Nevada and in Clark County decided to go all out with this idea, and they made it an entire experience. They had music, they had logos on the I voted stickers that were from the Raiders, and they had over 3,000 people vote on election day at Allegiant Stadium. And we are finding preliminarily, it's not set in stone, but we believe that 50% of them were first-time voters, which says to me probably young, probably some people who are really psyched to go to the stadium. And so I'm hoping that I'm going to be doing a case study of what went on in Las Vegas with the Allegiant Stadium, and I'm hoping to demonstrate that this is just a good thing for the universe, good thing for democracy, good thing for the teams, good thing for elections. And so we'll see where that research takes me. And I believe that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tova. I have known you through some pro-democracy spaces for a bit, but I haven't actually gotten to see this overview of this work, and it's wonderful, and I hope you'll continue with it. I'd like to just go ahead, since we have a little time before we open it up to the full panel, to see if anyone in the physical room here with us or in the Zoom room has any questions for Tova about that information. And if you do have a question in the Zoom, I think maybe
I see
raise your
one in the
hand.
chat about accessibility. I mean, that was another really cool thing. I mean, unlike government spaces, they're not required by the ADA. I mean, this could be wrong. Maybe somebody else on this panel can tell me, but I don't think that stadiums are required to be accessible like other spaces are under the ADA. But I can tell you they normally are. I mean, they have elevators typically. They certainly want to serve older and people with disabilities who are fans. So I'm pretty sure that accessibility is not an issue.
Sports teams do still have to follow all the ADA
Okay, there you go.
guidelines and everything. There's been a lot of conversation on over the years.
If I could add on to that, accessibility as a whole, right? Like I think when we in the not this 2024 election, the previous election, the Milwaukee Bucks used their arena as an early voting site, right? It was part of our or one of our roles that we could play it to be additive into the election cycle and make it more visible to, and our hope more accessible. And I think overall we did accomplish that by making our location an early voting site. I will say that there were people who said like, hey, you displaced what I'm used to, right? So accessibility can be a broader terminology to say, yeah, there were people who said, yeah, as cool as it is, you displaced and moved where I normally would go to vote, and that's something you also know, right? And I think that's valuable feedback as teams consider actions, ways to support, ways to, again, the word in our world is additive. How do we become additive to the process? Those are all things we ideate on, because plus it's still the same fans that are coming to our games that have an impression or a feeling of wanting to return to our arena. So I'm not saying that was a reason we didn't do it this past cycle, but it's all things that we weighed in the conversation of our role in the civic engagement space. So yeah, really important that buildings do prioritize internal accessibility for those that are coming. And I think we looked at it in a different way as well too on the external side.
Yeah, just to be clear, I mean, in the report, you'll see also, I couldn't agree more. We say that neighborhood polling locations should not be shut down because there's an arena opportunity. That's definitely on board with that.
Great. There was a question, Tyler had raised his hand, or their hand. Do you want to go with the question?
Yeah, so I'm the one that asked it, and I've done some disability voting access research as well. And my main question is like the walking distance, as I know navigating stadiums can be harder with longer lines and longer distances to the entrance. So that was part of my question as well. And I assume like stadiums might have better accommodations for that.
Well, and because they become polling places, all the other requirements of what needs to be in a polling place would stand. I mean, I don't know what it is team by team, but I assume if there's language assistance that's required, then language assistance is required, and all that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Tova? All right. Well, Tova, I will encourage you to chime in as we, continue the conversation with our representatives from the sports teams organizations. But for now, let's pivot to what the real life experiences look like for the panelists who are actually in the roles that are supporting community and charitable work of the sports organizations that are here today. So our first question for this segment is, I'd like to ask you all a little bit about what some of the key initiatives your organization is working on look like, so that we can get a sense of what does this work actually look like from these community engaged arms of the sports teams, or the charitable arms of the sports teams. And I think for this one, I'm gonna kind of go out of state guest, Sarah, first, and then I'll go to Bobby Joe, and then I'll go to Arvind. So Sarah, can you just kick us off and share a little bit about what are some of those key initiatives that the White Sox charities are working on, as well as, how does that connect to the community that the team is in, which in your case is the South Side of Chicago. I think of it, maybe you think of it more broadly than that. I'd love to hear how you think of it. What's the day-to-day work like? What are y'all working on?
So we, through White Sox Charities, kind of have three key pillars. The first is our volunteer corps. So in 2008, when President Obama was elected, who is a White Sox fan, he made this big call to serve and called for, Americans to serve their community. So we launched a White Sox volunteer corps where you could kind of volunteer alongside other White Sox fans. Within like a day, we had thousands of people that had signed up. So we realized very quickly that there was something here, and that people really did want to give back. So through that, now we are, I don't know how many years, 15, 20 years later, we have a core of about 5,000 people who volunteer. We put together about 5 opportunities a month. It could be going over to the food depository and helping sort food, going to the local book bank and getting books sorted for kids. It could be going and rehabilitating a school, like a lot of different things. We have 2 larger scale things per year, but about 5 a month. And those volunteers are so engaged. They really feel part of like the White Sox family, and they're giving back, which is what we love. So that's the one key pillar. The other is our Amateur City Elite ACE program. And 12, 13 years ago now, we kind of had a group of people that came together. One of our scouts was one of them and said, look, there's a lot of talent in the South Side of Chicago from a baseball standpoint, but scouts aren't coming to the South Side to look at these kids, professional scouts or even college recruiting. And these kids don't have the financial resources to play and travel baseball, which at this point in the game, travel sports is like really, if you're going to be seen anywhere, this is how you're going to be seen. So for them to get an opportunity to play in college is probably not going to happen because they're not playing travel. So we developed our own intercity travel baseball program. You have to try out, so it's highly competitive, and it is, needs based. So a lot of, all those demographics on the South Side that you think of, those are the kids playing in the program. Also, we found that, just the number of African Americans who are playing baseball has diminished every single year. That's a Major League Baseball larger issue that they've been working on. So we've been helping to get kids playing, get kids excited about baseball, but playing at a really high level. So now we've had over 300 kids go to college on baseball scholarships. So that's the whole goal of the program, is to use baseball as a way to get them to college. And we feel like once they go to college, they have a lot more opportunities in life than if they didn't go to college. We spend a lot of time focusing on our coaches, because the coaches make all the difference in the kids as far as like just being a good mentor, a good leader. The coaches become like family to the kids. So that's ACE. And then the last one is our grant giving. We have a grant program where we donate a couple $1 million a year through grants. So nonprofit organizations can apply for those. We do it once a year. Our giving areas are cancer research and treatment, child abuse prevention, youth education, and health and wellness. So that's kind of been our longest standing program. We've been doing that for many years. And then we launched a new grant type program this year where we're giving out some very specific grants for $125,000 in celebration of our 125th year as the White Sox as a team. So those are like more project specific, but that's all kind of in progress right now. So we're getting ready to announce those in May. So those are kind of our key pillars. We do a lot of other things, based on what our players are interested in, but those are like the ones that are always there, kind of the fixtures for us.
Yeah, that's great. And it's a really impressive array of what I imagine is pretty high touch programming. And it leads me to want to ask a question I did not include in advance, but how big is your team? How do you manage all of that? How many people do you have helping with all of that?
So every team's a little bit different, especially on the baseball side. Our community relations and charities is very blended. So specific on the community relations side, we have 3 people. They also handle player relations and wives relations. So if a sponsor needs a player to go sign autographs at a grocery store, that's coming through our department. We coordinate anything with the players. So there's 3 people on the community relations and player side. We have 3 on the White Sox charity side, 1 that kind of does a little bit of both. And then we have my boss is our executive director and vice president of White Sox charities, or vice president of community relations and executive director of White Sox charities. And then we have 2 full-time people on the youth baseball side to run ACE and our other community baseball programs. So in total 10, but we're a blended department, which is different than some teams.
Great. Thank you so much. Bobby Joe, do you mind going next and sharing a little bit about what the Green Bay Packers Foundation is working on as a part of their key initiatives? Your key initiatives.
Yep, I can do that. So the Green Bay
Thank you.
Packers Foundation is basically a grant-making entity. It is a private foundation. It is a 501c3, but we do not do any type of fundraising. Our major source of funding for the foundation is our club, the Green Bay Packers. We are the only community-owned team in the NFL. And because of that, we stretch our giving out across the entire state of Wisconsin. Our grant program through the Packers Foundation last year awarded $1.5 million to just about 400 nonprofits across the state of Wisconsin. So our grants are not huge, which is fine for some of those organizations. $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 is a lot of money for them. And the other piece of it is being able to attach the Green Bay Packers logo to their efforts, and they can use that then to go to other funders and say, the Packers have invested in us. Would you consider investing in us too? So it gives them some sort of credibility, is how it's been explained to me by various development people. Our focus areas change every year. So this year coming up, we will focus on animal welfare, environmental, civic and community, and lastly, I'll look over here, health and wellness, sorry. So we'll get upwards of 400 plus applications during that annual grant cycle. But I do also want to talk to about Green Bay Packers Give Back, which I wear that hat too. And that's our corporate giving. And our corporate giving is separate from the foundation, but that includes our in-kind donations, which are 4,000 or 5,000 requests a year that we receive for in-kind donations. We also do event sponsorships, which are primarily in the Green Bay or the Brown County area. We host free community events here at Lambeau Field. We also have player appearances, and a lot of alumni are involved in community events and so on that we host. Football outreach is huge for us. Girls Flag has been growing immensely. And then Make-A-Wish visits. We have Make-A-Wish kids come in for just about every one of our home games. Sometimes we have 2 kids come in. They get a great experience. They get a locker in the locker room. They get a chance to meet the players, the coaches. They have lunch with the players. And then they, of course, get to come to the game. And then they're on field on pregame. So us being a community-owned team gives us a unique outlook on how we interact in the community. So it's not just in Green Bay here, but it's all across the state.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And those vivid examples you just shared also just remind me of something that I wanted to kind of forecast at the beginning of the session, which is just this has become such a more visible part of our American life now, seeing the intersection between sports teams and players and, you know, acts of kindness and charitable activities. I mean, just watching the Super Bowl a couple of weekends ago, I was struck again by how much airtime between actual live football there was for you know, things that NFL players had done in their communities. And there was even an award that they give out to, I think, the NFL player that is recognized for their charitable acts and things like that. And I could be wrong, but my perception is that when I was a kid, this wasn't as big of a part of the visible sports world as it certainly is now. And maybe when we get into the questions further, some of you can reflect on that, the changes over time that you've seen. But Arvind, I know you have a kind of unique perspective on these questions because the Bucks have had a really exciting and varied set of activities over the last few years. Can you share a little bit about what that looks like now or how it's been over the last few years since during winning the championship and since?
Yeah, sure, Mary Beth. I'll first start by maybe giving a little background on kind of our structure and how we kind of strategize our community impact, similar to both Bobby Joe and Sarah. We also have our own kind of strategy and way we go about and focus areas of our community impact work. I think when we talk about philanthropy as a whole, we think about it in maybe 3 big buckets, right? Financial giving, programmatic engagement, as well as kind of just advocacy as a whole, right? We recognize each of our sports platforms have a microphone. We want to use it, right? We want to call attention to issues and causes and topics that galvanize not only like our employee base, but obviously our fan base and community around us. So when we talk about philanthropy and community impact, it's maybe in those 3 big buckets. And within those 3 big buckets, we focus on 3 primary areas or focus areas, health and wellness being a big one. We're a sports team. We want a healthy community. We want people to be active. From a youth-focused perspective, it's a lot of youth sports access and community renovations, and how do we create better basketball access and youth sports access in general. For adults, it's health and obesity management. How do we focus on reducing some of the barriers in our healthcare system to how do we use our platform, our resources, our programming with our healthcare partners to make healthcare more accessible. So, a diverse topic, but something we prioritize within one of our pillars. Education being another focus area. How do we help kids all around the state? Being a statewide team, like Bobby Joe said, our focus is the entire state of Wisconsin. How do we help school districts, educators, students improve their math scores and reading proficiencies? To where can we be additive in the process of thinking about what do teachers need to what do school districts need and what can we provide? Because I think one important thing that maybe you've heard from each of my colleagues up here is there is no like one size fits all model, right? There isn't a okay, you have to do this. This is the perfect solution. Like this group needs this, right? Like it's not that obvious. And so part of it is learning and developing these relationships and understanding the different ways our organization can support and engage, which I'll talk about in a quick second. But our third pillar being a general one, right? Similar to some of the teams you see across pro sports, we appeal to a lot of different audiences. And so community betterment is a third kind of pillar of ours, which allows us to do environmental work or military support to address food insecurity issues in our community. And so I represent that, and civic engagement is a huge focus of that too, which I'll talk about here as well, maybe connecting back to Tova. So I say that to give you a little perspective to the focus areas, the avenues of which we think about where we prioritize our time, where we can make community impact. I think that's the fundamental goal, right, of all of our work. And how we structure our work is to create change, to help people, to do good, connect the resources of our organization into our community in different ways. And so that's maybe the strategy look of how we do it. And so much of it is programmatically involving players into the work that they do and learning their interests and finding ways to connect them into the community, mobilizing employees, like you've heard from colleagues. But it's a constant cycle of learning to educating to figuring out different ways to be a part of the process. Civic engagement, maybe the last few years, has been a really increased avenue of focus for us. And then part of that is obviously the world around us dictates tactics, right? Dictates what we want to focus on. The NBA, our American community have really put an emphasis on talking about voting work and voting processes and our civic engagement responsibilities. And the NBA community, the Bucks very specifically, have taken an active role in that over the last few years, and has become a newer priority maybe over the last election cycle over the last 4 to 5 years. You can see it in how we brand ourselves, to how we think about some of our philanthropic giving, to nonprofit work that does voting registration or voting advocacy work, to our programming, player engagement, to coaching staff engagement in the community is now tied to visiting local colleges to talk about voting, or attend high school pep assemblies where we're encouraging people to go register and sign up. And so civic engagement has been more than just how do we turn our arena into early voting location. It's how do we utilize that commitment in our civic responsibilities to engage it all throughout our organization. And that's some of the really fun things I've seen us pivot to do a little bit more of the last few years, something that's really exciting in our world. And it's dictated by the passion and interests of the people we serve, right? Bobby, Joe, Sarah, and I all have owners that we report to. They have interests that help dictates these priorities, but it's our colleagues who play, it's our influencers that way, it's the community around us are all what drive our mission, our work, our impact. And so for our MBA community, voting and civic engagement has been a huge part of it. It's why you see a lot of MBA players in very visible commercials, to coaching staff doing their advocacy, to why a lot of MBA teams have either considered using their arena or activate in different ways. I think one of the more really fun things we've seen is being in Wisconsin and Milwaukee is the interest for teams to engage, right? To be a microphone, to be part of these voting efforts. And it's been an interesting challenge and balance of learning how do you stay nonpartisan, to right down the middle, to make sure that everybody is included in these types of things. And so I'll pause there, Mary Beth, just to maybe connect it back to Tova to say voting has been a huge part of the NBA world and part of our social responsibility strategy for the Bucks, and it's part of what's shaped not only just what we do as a Bucks Foundation and a philanthropic wing, as well as what we do on our day-to-day social responsibility work.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And Arvind, I think you kind of walked us through just a little bit of a ride of just how many issues a sports team in a city like Milwaukee could be thinking about. I guess I'll just see if Tova wants to reflect back on any of that, since there was a lot about voting there. And if not, no problem, Tova. I know I don't want to put you on the spot, but
No, that's
did you have
okay,
any?
because no, Arvin knows I'm a fan. The Bucks are the best. They've done more probably in this space than anybody. And I think all of it is important. I know about the sort of rallies that have been held in the high schools and getting tons of high school seniors to register and all this kind of thing. So, I mean, all of that also is an indicator of commitment to participation and civic engagement. I just thought that, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to highlight here is that there was an enormous drop off. And not necessarily the Bucks, but in general, there was a drop off in involvement, especially among individual teams as opposed to the league. So that's, that was what I was saying.
Yeah.
No question. And I think we probably see it and felt it across the board, right? From the Bucks standpoint, we weren't a team that used our arena for early voting this past year. But one of the things that we did try to do was host the city's election commission for training as they train poll workers. And so finding different ways to be valuable, maybe was different things that teams thought of this year to maybe ultimately impacted the overall participation being different, but it were different ways that teams thought of support this year too.
Yeah, thank you for that. So Arvind started to get into this a little bit in his comments, but our next question really was to be about, so when you are crafting initiatives or you are making decisions about grants, what does the decision-making structure or body look like? How are decisions being made? Obviously, from hearing from you, there is such a variety of things that these organizations can be doing in theory in the community, but at some point you have to sort of narrow it down and create action plans. And we're here at a Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies, and my training is in sort of the legal and structural stuff around these organizations, and our students are learning about that. So if we could get a little bit into the weeds on just, is it your board at the foundation for the Packers, for example, that is reviewing grant applications or making decisions about focus areas, or is it the staff team at the White Sox that's deciding about, we're going to create this new baseball program on the south side of Chicago? Just how are the decisions being made, and how does that relate to the structural aspects of these organizations? And I think with this one, I'd love to start with Bobby Joe, because when she and I talked one-on-one before this, Bobby Joe, you did kind of start to describe this to me. So I think you've got it on the ready. Do you mind kicking us off here?
No problem. So starting with our foundation. So we have 10 trustees, all of which are members of the Green Bay Packers Board of Directors. And one is also part of the Green Bay Packers Executive Committee. So they are the individuals who are reviewing the grant applications. They do have a set of guidelines they have to work within, but some of their personal interests, or I shouldn't say personal interests, no, their business experience comes into play when they're reviewing those grant applications. I mean, we tell them, these are the focus areas for the year that we have to adhere to, but they're ultimately making the decisions as far as, is this organization one that we want to align our brand with? Or are they doing things that are falling outside of what they should be doing? And it wouldn't be a good idea to have the Packers Foundation logo attached to them. So they're making those types of decisions as they're deciding where to distribute that money to. On our corporate side, we do have some initiatives that come through the NFL, Packers versus Cancer, Inspire Change, which was really the social justice initiative is what that started out as. Salute to Service. So those are some initiatives that come through the NFL. There are others, but we thankfully have the opportunity to look at how do those initiatives actually fit within our community. And we look at our community being obviously Brown County, because that's where the stadium is located. But we have to look at how does it fit within our state, you know, the areas that we serve, the people that we serve, you know, how can we make the best impact on those that are around us? And sometimes those initiatives that are coming through the NFL just don't fit in our area. So we pass on them. But on our corporate side too, we have to be very cognizant of, well, years ago when the stadium was renovated, there was an additional 0.5% sales tax that was put in place to help fund the renovations of the stadium. So we needed to look at how were ways that we could give back to those that have given to us in order to renovate the stadium and make it a 365-day-a-year venue versus 10 games a year. So that's when the community events started. You know, we host 3, 4, 5 free community events every year that anyone can come to with no charge. So we're always looking at what's going on in our backyard, what's going on at a larger scope. But then we also, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but we have to be cognizant of not, like Arvin was talking a lot about voting and so on, and we haven't really done a lot. Yes, our Johnsonville Tailgate Village was open as a polling spot, but we hosted a naturalization ceremony here in Lambeau Field where 99 people took that oath. They were from 32 different countries. We were cautious as far as how we were publicizing that for reasons beyond the scope of my position, but it just, I think we're in a little bit different environment maybe than what Milwaukee or Chicago is. Different issues, different ways people look at things. And I guess I'll stop at that point.
Oh, that's so helpful, Bobby Joe. Thank you. Very real aspects of the context. Thank you for that. Now, thinking through still, Sarah, sort of how these decisions are made and how we shape the programming in these organizations. You mentioned a little bit about your staffing. Thanks for getting into those details with me on the previous question, but can you share a little bit more about how decisions are made, you know, when it comes to, are we going to initiate a new program or continue to support a program or shape the impact and the things that we're really investing in?
Yeah, we try and be very thoughtful about what we're doing. We also try and be very responsive to kind of the community need while still keeping going like our existing program. So a lot of it comes down to fundraising. We're self-funded. The nice thing here, which is different at every team, is that the White Sox cover all of like our administrative expenses, our salaries, our office space, things like that. Because there's some teams that pay for all of that. So that means, but we also start every year basically at zero. So we can only give out and have programming for what we bring in terms of fundraising. So we kind of have to look at last season's revenue to plan the next year's, you know, that's why we started the Diamond Impact Award. We had a few really good years fundraising wise in a row, and it allowed us to be able to do that. On the community relations side, that's a White Sox budget. So it's a little bit different. It depends on, what are our player interests. One good example of all of this is the Chicago Sports Alliance. So in 2016, our owner, Jerry Reinsdorf, who also owns the Chicago Bulls, he just was really, he kind of had enough with all the gun violence in Chicago. It was an all-time high, like we've got to do something. So he called all the owners of all the major teams in Chicago and said, we need to come together and do something about this. So we created the Chicago Sports Alliance. We give out very directed grants to organizations who are working in the gun violence reduction space. Each team contributes $200,000. We do have a match with the McCormick Foundation, which is a local grant making organization. So in total, we give out $1.5 million a year through that collective. And that's just an example of like, we had to be responsive to what was actually going on in our community and how our community is being impacted. A lot of the work we do is on the south side of Chicago. That's where the greatest need is in the city, the south and west side. But that the tragedy on July 4th in Highland Park, which is north of the city, and really, we're a two-team market, no surprise. That's more like Cubs territory, really. But that impacted all of Chicago. Like it really did. Like it was such a devastating thing for those people. So we made a significant contribution to supporting the community foundations that were really trying to help that community recover. While we really focus on the south side, we're not only on the south side, if that makes sense. But we are very Chicago based. That's where our fans live and work, and we want to support them. So every year is different. Like this year, for example, we have a very young team. So none of them really have an interest area yet. We're trying to work with them to find what that interest area is. It's a fit for them. But there's other teams where we have veterans come in that have like established, like, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to focus on. So we have to kind of pivot every year based on who's on our team from a player standpoint. But beyond that, I would really say it starts with our owner, Jerry Reinsdorf, and that, the different interest areas, everything that we would want to do on a high level like that, he ultimately would have a decision on. Like when we started the volunteer corps and we started the ACE program, like now on the individual grant review, that's myself and our executive director who do the grant review. So that's kind of the mix, I think.
Great, great. So there's lovely people both in the room here and on Zoom. So I want to make sure we have enough room for their questions, but I'm going to just leave us with one last one from me. Actually a choice of two, because I can't resist making sure we get these out there. One is, and Sarah already kind of started leaning into this, is how do the players come into the work? And I know, we've seen as Wisconsin sports fans, very distinct examples of this. I'm thinking mostly of the Bucks, and the example that comes to mind for me is when the holidays came to Milwaukee, there was so much buzz about them really wanting to have sort of, purpose-driven work that they would do in Milwaukee when they were in Wisconsin. And obviously a lot of the players at the Bucks, not to pick on you, Arvin, but, called some things over the last few years, like walking off the court and during the bubble NBA playoffs and other things where we know that the players have interests and are passionate in their own rights. And Sarah, you kind of alluded to this, and I'm not as clear on it with the Packers. So I'm curious if any of you would share how the players and their interests sort of intersect beyond what's already been said, and how you kind of navigate that, because I imagine it's a lot, and there's a lot of variety, and there might be a lot of things that don't always align potentially. And then either respond to that if you're up for it. The other one that I think would be fun to explore is what are kind of the highlights and lowlights, and what about the highlights and lowlights for the team and how that relates to your relationships in the community and the work? So we've had some really great seasons in this group recently and some really hard seasons in this group recently. And I know that can correlate to the work that you're doing in the community. So that's your menu of options of things that you can look into for the last round, and then we'll open it up to some questions. Anybody want to kick us off on this?
I'll go first.
Okay.
So
Thanks.
the first question was players. Players have huge influence in the work we do. Their interests, first and foremost, they're your most visible. They are my most visible colleagues. They're some of our most famous colleagues, right? So there's a fundamental obligation and requirement to engage them in the work we do. I'd say it simply put, like NBA players in their contracts have a requirement to do community appearances with the team that they're employed with. And so my team, our department's job is to figure that out in collaboration. So much of it is relationship building, learning about interests, to building a relationship to understand their backgrounds, to figure out ways to connect them to the local community. I think part of the intentionality of our buckets, right, of our general buckets, are always involving the youth sport version of what they participate in, right? So oftentimes the easiest thing for some of our younger players to embrace and to enjoy are some of the youth sports elements or youth basketball things. So it's a total spectrum of different things, but the biggest thing is engagement, like building a relationship. And they do have a major influence of the things that we maybe prioritize or tactical programming things that we do, to ways that we engage. So yeah, big time influence, and it's really important to have a good relationship with players, their families, their agents, because I think the thing you try to avoid being is somebody that's just asking them for something else, right? It's the biggest like thing to get over in our world is we're colleagues, right? So we got to work together, and how you do that is through a relationship. Part of that leads to, and not to be a downer, the lowlights, right? When we trade players and we just went through one, it's the crappy part of it, right? Like
Yeah.
you lose colleagues in addition to just the player, you lose the person a little bit. You lose some of their community impact work, and I'd say Chris Middleton being a very specific example, like he's been my coworker for almost 10 years, and so there's been a lot of things we've done in the community together to. Had discussions on, collaborations on, and that's not just with him, but his team and his family. So things like that change. Some of his impact work changes. I think that the truth of the matter there is always like, as you grow and you have veteran-based players, as Sarah was alluding to, like it's reminding the community that they're their own professional, right? That they do their own thing sometimes. It's not always through the team, and so it's kind of as they get older, you try to build that separation a little bit. At least that's how we do it in our world, just to remind people like, hey, as our players are philanthropic, which is amazing, that sometimes their own work, right, and not necessarily always through the team. And so that education is also some of the challenges we face when we're dealing with players coming and going to the transition nature of pro sports. But yeah, otherwise it's a lot of fun.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Arvind. Bobby Joe, you want to chime in on this one?
Sure. So my director and a coworker of mine actually do most of the work with our players and our alumni. But you know, we hear about this, what they do in our staff meetings, and we see it ourselves. But a huge part, like Arvind mentioned, is relationship building and just learning what each one of those individuals have a passion for. Some of them come in, they already have, you know, something set in mind, what they'd like to get involved in. They're already involved in it in their hometown or where they come from. And they want to continue that work here. Some of them want to do something a little bit different. There are also some that I've learned over the years want to get involved in things, but they don't want people to know. They don't want the media there. They want to do it for what they have said are the right reasons. So I found that to be very interesting. My director has shared with me a couple of stories through the years where, you know, she's gotten a phone call from a player who did not have a very good, people don't think very highly of him as an individual. On the field was great, but not so much off the field. He wanted to visit children in hospitals in Green Bay, but he didn't want anybody to know about it. So she left her family for that holiday and accompanied him, set some things up with hospitals and so on, and set some things up, and they went and made some visits. And you have a little different opinion of an individual when you hear things like that. But I think the thing that I've learned over the years is that these guys are just like you and I. You know, the comment that I've made is they put their pants on the same way you and I do. It's just their pants are a lot more expensive and most times a lot bigger than what ours are. But it's just trying to figure out what their niche is, what they're comfortable in. They can play in a stadium with 70, 80,000 people and how many millions of people that are watching them, but put them in front of an audience in a high school auditorium, and they're not comfortable. So it's putting them in spots where they can succeed.
Yeah, I just have to reflect back something that always touches my heart, though, about Green Bay Packers culture, which is I think you all deserve the credit for being the first to do this. I think there's been some copycats, but it always touches my heart when you do the preseason parade with the little kids' bikes into the stadium. And, you know, these huge men that are very powerful and wealthy are like smiling, you know, with 100-watt smile riding like a little pink,
Tricycle.
5-year-old bicycle with streamers on it. And I just always think like that is so cool that when people come to this team, they just sort of buck up and do it and get into it, because it's just a funny little tradition. And was that a Green Bay Packers original? I've seen some other teams doing something like that now, but I think it was y'all that did it first.
Yeah, that's biking to training camp. And if I'm not mistaken, that goes back to Vince Lombardi days.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just a great example of how the culture of the team can also be something that players can feel a part of and get on board with, even if it stretches their comfort zone a little bit. So
Yeah.
follow checkers on like socials. You can see that every year, and it's wonderful. Sarah, how have the players come into the work for you all?
I think
Or
one thing I had to like learn early on in my career is like you can't force player, like you want them to be genuinely engaged and genuinely want to give back. And there's some people that just aren't, and that's just humanity. Like individuals, athletes aside, are people that, there's some people that just like don't care about helping their neighbor, don't care about whatnot. So it's hard because you want to get them involved, you want them to get them to do things. Their agent may be telling them the same thing, but sometimes they just don't. So you have to find what can they do that would make them feel comfortable and look authentic. But then you have the other side of the coin where you have players that come to you with like a million ideas and they have all these things they want to do. And so it's like, you really have to learn to work with both. And then in our case, for anyone that doesn't follow baseball, the White Sox set a record last year for the worst record in Major League Baseball history, which is a long history. So in a year like that, look, if you're working in anything except for on the baseball operations, basketball operations, football operations side, you have no control over the win-loss record. You might like to think that you do, but like there's nothing that you have less control over. But it really dictates your entire season. If you're winning, everyone wants a piece of everything you're doing. If you're losing, people, and that's the thing about sports, which I like love and hate at the same time, is that people like some of the things they were commenting and like wishing people were like dead. I'm like, it's a baseball team. Like, really? Like, but that's how passionate people get, which is good when you're winning, not so great when you're losing. So that's why it was so important last year for us to do all this great community work to basically say like, okay, ignore what's going on in the field, but look at this nice whatever that someone did. We had our most engaged team we've ever had last year. So it made our job super easy. And in a year when you're losing that much, a lot of times players are not the most approachable. They don't want to go do things they don't have to because they just want to like do anything but like think about how bad they are basically. But last year was not that way. They were so engaged and so willing. But at the same time, I was actually looking through, we just published our community impact report from last year, and it's like all these players did all this amazing work and they've all been traded, which happens when you have a bad team. So we also struggle with like, you do all this cool programming for an organization and they feel this connection to the player and to the team, and that player leaves. It's like, what do you do with that relationship? I'll give one example, as he was here for several years. So Jose Abreu was one of our top players for many years. He had this program with an organization that's a school for kids with autism. They would come out to the game. There's a whole curriculum they did. And if they like met all of their curriculum goals, they got to come and meet Jose before a game. And it was like, I mean, it really impacted these kids like lives. I mean, it was so touching to see how impacted they were. Well, Jose gets traded. Well, then what happens to this program? Like, we can't just have it go away, but also like the person behind it isn't here anymore. So we still do a lot with the school and we still try and work with them as much as we can, but we can't have that like really fun and sexy piece. So it's like, that's constantly a struggle with us, is like, how do you get these organizations so excited and then like the player leaves and when they get traded, they like leave that day. Like, it's not like you can be like, oh, for the next 2 months, we're going to wind down this program. No, like they're gone. So that's the biggest, I think, challenge that we have, is how to meet the players where they at, find their interest areas, but then when they leave, then what do you do? So we have our kind of our core things that we do all the time, and then add in the player stuff is kind of how we look at it.
Wonderful. All righty. Well, let's see what questions we might have from the audience on Zoom and the folks in the room. I've got a hand up already. Go for it.
Hello.
Just speak loudly because they're picking up the mic
Okay.
somewhere over here. Yeah.
I have no problem with speaking loudly.
All right,
So
perfect.
I'm Jody Wires, and I work for the local nonprofit in the area, Operation Fresh Start. And Bobby Joe, I actually have a question for you. Obviously, Green Bay will be on the big stage with the draft coming up. So I was just kind of wondering about some of the philanthropy or community engagement that is kind of being planned around that large event.
Thanks, Jody. One thing I told Mary Beth, I said, I don't have a lot of involvement with the draft at this point in time, so I can't really talk a lot about it, but
Okay.
here's what I can tell you. I've seen a lot of nonprofits that are trying to create events to create to catch on the buzz that's going to be happening around the draft. They're kind of doing their own thing as far as that goes. Yeah, that's about what I can tell you. I mean, we'll have 20 alumni that my director is working on getting them in. There's going to be a taste of the NFL that's going to be happening at one of the businesses downtown Green Bay. And they'll be involved in different things that whether it's announcing draft picks or whatever. A lot of that is yet to be determined. We've been told that as this is an NFL event, after the Super Bowl is done, then planning will really shift over to the draft. So there's a lot. I'm not aware of it at this point in time, but I know that there are some that are really trying to capitalize on whatever they can with 250 some thousand people that are supposed to be in the area for those 3 days.
Yeah, I will say to Bobby Joe's credit, she immediately said she's not going to have very much to share about that and was thinking it would come up, and I should have protected you against that question. Hey,
You did good.
I learned something from that limited response. So we'll keep our eye on that as the planning continues. Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Frank Davis. I run a local nonprofit here in Wisconsin, in Madison. And I guess my question is, I heard y'all speak about trustees and individuals that oversee your foundations and the grant process. Been dealing with grants nationally for a long time. And one of the things that I know, normally what happens when they get down to the grassroots organizations, they are so rigid and stuck where a lot of times they either look over us or we don't necessarily fit within how you want to structure the grant. So my question is, what do y'all do individually to make sure grassroots organizations are in the conversation before y'all even send out RFPs?
I can say, from one of the Bucks NBA perspective, right? Like, but must have been during COVID, 4 years ago or so. The NBA launched an NBA Foundation, a new fiscal entity, a 501c3 created by ownership groups at the NBA level to help provide funding to nonprofits, grassroots organizations. And I'd say, listen, there isn't a perfect process to it, but one of the things that I do like about it is the reliance on local teams, right? So my colleagues and I get to advocate. We get to jump on monthly calls to be like, all right, who applied from Wisconsin? What do we know about them? Is the applications from Wisconsin's low? All right, how do we create a webinar or do some education at our games to create awareness to what the ultimate goal of the NBA Foundation is? So I cite that as an example of one positive thing in our world of how do we make sure funding gets to smaller groups. It's not coming all the time, truthfully, but it's at least some positivity that I'm seeing where smaller groups are cutting through that fray through the work and advocacy of some of our teams. And I'm excited to see that growth continue in different markets as well too. And I'm hopeful to see that happen here with other teams.
Yeah, maybe Sarah, please.
Sorry. So I think to Arvin's point, there was an organization that just kept applying for funding. They weren't a fit. They were very grassroots, very small. But we have a lot of in-kind opportunities, whether it's tickets to a game or a in-kind donation, whatnot. So he just always kind of kept in touch with me. And then he invited me to their they were doing some sort of like open house type thing. He invited me to that. I went to that. And so I think it's just the constant, once we can kind of put like a visual with the name of the organization, because we're getting a lot of requests, that always helps. So then fast forward like a couple years later, and he had kind of kept in touch with me. I would help him out with, tickets or whatever here or there. We have an employee grant program. So it's meant specifically for grassroots organizations and small organizations. So all of our employees have the opportunity to nominate a nonprofit. And that's whether it's here in Chicago or in the suburbs where they live, but Chicago land based. And then we have an employee committee that reviews the applications and awards funding. We have about $70,000 a year through that program. Well, here a year or two later, here comes the same organization, an employee nominated them, and they end up getting funding. So I think we've tried to find ways to really find opportunities for those smaller groups, but I think it's also an opportunity for the small organization to not just send in a grant request that's got, a lot of typing on it and a lot of words, like really putting an identity with them always helps.
Yeah, Arvin had a follow-up, I think. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry, yeah, real quick, Bob, before you go, I'd say I just wanted to echo what Sarah said. I think I love that, right? Like for our Bucks Foundation, yeah, my board of directors, which are the owners, make the final decision, but a lot of our day-to-day work of meeting groups, getting to know people is what goes into sometimes these recommendations, right? Like building that trust. Oftentimes our board is just like, yep, all right, you vetted them, cool, let's go. And so for similar to Sarah, like one of the things I love to see to make sure that I do prioritize smaller groups that maybe we haven't heard of, is that personal relationship. And so a lot of it is just getting invited for a site visit of like, hey, I'm not asking you for anything, but could you spare 30 minutes to come learn a little bit about our program? Or do you have 30 minutes to jump on a call so we can explain something to you? I think that's a huge part of the relationship building that I'm seeing get better in our nonprofit world that helps me make sure I continue to prioritize smaller groups that way.
No, I just wanted to add.
Oh, sorry, Bobby. Just gonna say both great examples and ideas, but Bobby Joe.
Yeah, I just wanted to add two in response to that question. We don't have a letter, an LOI process. So basically, for our foundation, as long as that organization's been a nonprofit for at least 2 years, they're based in the state of Wisconsin, the funding that they're asking for fits within our focus areas for that particular year, they could submit an application. It's not an extensive application. Every one of those applications goes through a pre-screening before it's assigned to one of our trustees. And then those trustees are making phone calls. Some of them are going out and making those site visits before dollars are granted, or that's what they factor into whether or not they're going to suggest dollars are granted. So something we've talked about amongst our trustees is that we're not in the business really of telling these organizations how to do their business. They know their business best, but we'll help them with some funding so that they can do their business in the best way that they're able to do.
Great, thank you all. I wanted to just follow up with a couple of reflections back on that question. Great question. First of all, those in-kind donations, I was thinking about this before when those came up, but I know when I was the executive director of a small nonprofit, we sometimes were not successful in getting direct funding from the sports foundations, but it is true that when you get a nice piece of merch or assigned something in a silent auction, that actually made like a pretty big difference for us sometimes. So I just wanted to like lift up that sometimes even those smaller things when you're in those beginning stages of the relationship can help a lot. I know the organization that I ran, we had an event where by having some of that stuff, our silent auction, just the whole event just looked more legit, and we were a small organization. But then of course in time, I'm sure all organizations would like to go beyond that, but it was a nice way to start kind of having a relationship and showing that we had a relationship with the sports organization. I also would be remiss if I didn't do a shameless plug for the center, that we have worked with funders on how to update their RFP and granting processes to take into consideration the new thinking about, equitable grant making and things. So if anybody knows of anybody in the Major League Sports world that's looking for that, we would love to hear from them. And I do think it's a valid thing to review occasionally, to the point of the question, because we have heard that in the philanthropic world for a long time, that sometimes those applications can be kind of onerous. It doesn't sound like any of you are doing that exactly that way, but it is a theme that I think can come up. I think we have a question in the chat. Kendall, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I work at Hope Street in Milwaukee, and I'm a director over community center there, and have gotten help from both the Green Bay Packer Foundation and the Bucks in different ways. So thank you guys for that, and just for sharing some stuff. But I think for more of a professional piece, I think of both of your jobs, and I think that is a really awesome job. I would love to do something like that, giving away money for such a big organization, and one that impacts us so culturally in Wisconsin, especially, like, just sounds like such a dream to me. So I guess first, is it all that it's cracked up to be? Is it great and lovely to give away money? And then on the second side of that, what does that professional path look? What has that looked like? How did you guys get into that spot?
I can start. So it is fun to give away money. It is not so much to tell people that they are not getting money, because that's part of the job too. And unfortunately, there's more people you're telling no to than they're telling yes to. So, because you're a sports team, people are like big fans of the team. They take it very personally. I've never worked for like a foundation that's not tied to a sports team, but I would think that there's a little bit more, just people feel like it's like their team, so like they deserve the funding or whatever, and like it's just not possible. Like we have more requests than we have resources, basically. So it is a lot of fun. I'm so glad I get to do this, but it is really hard to tell people no. So and some people are very persistent, and they really can't take no for an answer. So that makes it even more challenging as to how to tell them no. But regardless, as far as getting into this field, I think there's a lot of different paths. I find I've moved all over the country for this. I grew up in Central Illinois. My first job was in Fresno, California. I moved to, actually my first job technically was all over the country when I was working in football on the TV side. Then I moved to Fresno. Then I moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania. And then I moved here. So like Fresno, California, Allentown, Pennsylvania, not really the types of places you're like dreaming to live in. They were great. Like I really enjoyed my experience. I am the only one on this panel that has worked in minor league sports, and I will say you get a lot of experience very quickly. Every time I'm hiring for a job and I see someone that has minor league experience, like that's already like, an add on for them, because that means that they can do a lot of different things. They can think critically quickly. And they're willing to jump in and do literally anything, because that's what minor league baseball is doing whatever's needed of you when it's needed. So I think I bet if you had a panel of 50 people, not one person's gonna have the same path. So obviously opening up your location on where you're willing to work certainly helps, because, like in Milwaukee, there's only so many professional teams. In Green Bay, there's only one. So if you only want to live in Green Bay, you only have one option. And, there's just getting your foot in the door. I do think even if you do get a job in sports, there's a lot of people work in ticket sales. That's by far the largest department here. And we'd opened up a job a couple years ago, and we're looking for a couple years of experience for this, entry level type position. And someone that worked in our ticket sales department for a couple years was like, oh, this is like my dream job. I've always wanted to work in community relations. But that person had never once come and talked to me, never once reached out and said, like, this is my passion, this is what I want to do. So like always, and whether that's you're in sports or you're not, but just expressing that, because if we have a job open, and I know that Kendall from Hope Street is like looking to get into sports, like I might send that to you and be like, just so you know, like this is open. So I think there's a lot of different paths for a lot of different people, but it's definitely, there's only so many jobs. Like for Major League Baseball, there's only 30 teams. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Bobby Joe, Arvin, thoughts on this one? Is it what it's cracked up to be? Any tips on how to get into it?
I'll just say quickly, my path getting here was, I mean, I feel listening to, my fellow panelists here that I got into this job really easy. And just kind of grew with it as it grew. I guess from that aspect is, don't be afraid to learn. Always continue to learn. I am going to celebrate a big birthday in a couple of months, and I learn every single day. So I think once you shut yourself down, think you know it all, and there's nothing more to learn, I think that's a problem. I feel very fortunate to be in the position I'm in. I never take it for granted. It's hard, as Sarah has mentioned, it's hard to give money away because sometimes you need to make the right decision, and it's not the best decision for everybody, what everybody thinks is the best decision. It's difficult to say no for someone who doesn't appreciate conflict. It's very hard to say no, but the people that I work with that do in-kind donations, we've said over and over again, if we say no to something, what can we say yes to? So it might not be a cash sponsorship, it might be an in-kind donation for their fundraising event. But the reward is seeing the faces on kids that come to the community events, or the amount of money that was raised on an item that they wouldn't have had if we wouldn't have sent that item to them, or the impact that grant made on that very small organization in the northern part of the state. And that's what keeps me here for 24 years.
Yeah, thank you. Arvin, I know you and I have corresponded at times when you've been in the heat of even like really celebratory moments, like when the Bucks won the championship, but I don't think that that's an easy job. How would you respond to this question?
I echo what my colleagues on this panel have said. There's a lot of wonderful things. I love giving away money. That's the best part. No question. The hardest part is saying no. In fact, I tell people all the time, our team president in my job interview 9 years ago was like, that was one of the questions, is how do you say no to people? And I was like, is this a trick question, or do you really want me to say no right now? It's the hardest part. Like, there's a reason why we like our jobs and we do our jobs. It's to help people. It's really that. Like, there's something about that our professional jobs allow us to do more of. So I appreciate that immensely. It's a job though, Kendall, like any job. Like, there's a lot of things I don't like. I don't love working the weekends every weekend. I'm sure Sarah can tell you a lot about weekends. Both of us are very envious sometimes of Bobby Joe's game schedule. There's things like that are tough. I don't love, missing kids' sports or family things because of games when they're just games. And as you've been in the business longer and you develop your seniority, there, you can prioritize. But the point being is that it's not a traditional job. It's not Monday through Friday. It's not a 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. type job. Even in our community work, it's nights and weekends and odd hours to over holidays to, different things. And so I think that's a really hard part and an eye-opening part of the profession that you don't realize until you get into it. My background is similar in the sense of like, I've always been around sports. I love sports. I went to UW. I did journalism. Little plug, I teach in the journalism department. So I love coming back to UW, and that's where I cultivated and furthered my passion for sports. And every job since then has been sports related, if it's not just been in sports. And so I've just followed my passion and learned some of the things that I like and don't like about certain structures. And that's kind of just what helped me get me to where I am. But there's a lot of good things about working in sports.
All right,
One
that
more-
seems like a really, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just to tie onto that, the one thing I'll say is I think all of us have individual people we can associate with our work, which is really cool. I'll tell one quick story. We did wasn't Make-A-Wish, but Make-A-Wish type day one day, like 10 years ago, probably now, for this little boy. He was 4 years old. He had a terrible form of cancer. He had a really grim prognosis, and it was a whole day for him. He ended up beating cancer and did great. So fast forward 7 or 8 years later, he's now, I think he was 11. I got a call out of nowhere from his dad that he passed away, like hours before. First of all, the fact that his dad's calling me as one of the first people he's calling just shows the power they felt like they had connected to the team. he had basically had a stroke, and it was from all the treatment he had gone through, and his body just couldn't fight it anymore, even though he had been cancer free for several years at that point. So I went to his the funeral. This kid's now 11. He came here when he was 4, and we had brought him out a lot of times over the years, but at 4 is when he had this big day. 90% of the photos at that funeral were of his day here. So it shows the impact we had on that family's life. And I like hope I never take that for granted, because even if it's just, oh, you think you're just doing this meet and greet with a player, like it's a big deal for that family and that kid. And seeing how, you know, like a 4-year-old to an 11-year-old is a big difference, and that all of the photos at the funeral were of his experience here. So that's the coolest part I think about our work, is like you can put faces with the work we do.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that story. All right, we are at time. What an incredibly rich discussion. We appreciate you all and you giving us this time so much. Let's give a round of applause for Camilla. Just before we all part, we want to thank you for coming. There's our socials if you want to stay in touch with us. We hope you will. And please use the QR code if you're willing to take a few moments and give us some feedback. Great. Well, hello, everyone. We are very pleased to be able to provide this bonus session recording with the Executive Director of the Brewers Community Foundation, Cecilia Gore. We promised it, and we're now adding it into our wonderful panel discussion that we did for our CommUniversity session on the 20th of February. Welcome, Cecilia. So glad to have you here and to get to learn a little bit about your work at the Brewers Community Foundation.
Well, thank you for having me. And let me just say that I'm thrilled that we figured out a way to allow me to participate. I had the pleasure of being in Arizona at spring training. So, you know, this just is a great opportunity to continue to do the work and connect with people and still do the other things that I have to do.
Exactly, exactly. I think many of us were feeling a bit envious of you when we were meeting in February in Wisconsin, and we knew that's where you were, but we're happy that you can be there and do that. So would you mind sharing a little bit about how you got into this work, how long you've been in the role, and what brought you there?
Sure. I'm happy to tell my story. I am a lifelong resident of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I've been working for a number of years now. I would say I'm probably a senior executive in many ways, but I started my work in community affairs at Wisconsin Gas about 30 years ago. And I was involved in the community. We worked with nonprofits. I served on a lot of boards. I was a loaned executive for United Way and United Performing Arts Fund and the United Negro College Fund, and just really enjoyed the work. So as I continued my career at Wisconsin Gas, I then moved to Wisconsin Electric when we merged, and I was an external affairs representative. And from there, I was there for a year, and then had the pleasure of working for the Jane Bradley Pettit Foundation. And for those of you that know that foundation and Jane Bradley Pettit, she was one of the largest philanthropists in the state at the time. She built the Bradley Center with her money, the entire Bradley Center. Her naming rights are at the ice rink, the art museum. She probably funded every nonprofit throughout the community. And so I had the pleasure of being the program officer for that foundation. And I was there for about 10 years. And then the market got a little shaky. So I started looking around. And Mark Attanasio had purchased the Brewers. And he was going through the organization and wanted to make some changes. And this position became available. And so I applied, and the lawyer that was on the board for Jane Bradley Pettit Foundation was also on the board with the Brewers at one time, because Mrs. Pettit was one of the owners.
Okay.
And so he gave me a great reference. And then I met with Mark and a number of the executives at the Brewers, and I was able to get the job and I was really excited about it. And fast forward, I'm going into my 17th season.
Wow, great. I can't believe Ignacio has owned the team for that long. That's,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have put that number on it, but time flies.
22 years. I think
Okay.
he had it for 4 or 5 years before I started.
Sure, around the time of the stadium build.
Yep.
Yes, yes, yes. Great. Well, that's a wonderful story that's pretty different than some of the other colleagues that were in the webinar in February. And there are various ways of getting into this work.
Yeah.
So that's a great additional example. So tell us a little bit about what the Brewers Community Foundation is doing in terms of key programming. Anything you'd like to share about sort of how the decisions get made or what the day-to-day work looks like would also be of interest.
Well, I'll start by saying that Brewers Community Foundation is the charitable arm of Milwaukee Brewers Baseball Club. And our mission says we harness the pride, passion, and commitment of our fans, players, and other supporters to positively impact the community. And the goal of the foundation is to assure that this team is a part of the fabric of this community. So yes, we provide entertainment. We have a wonderful team on the field. We are an economic driver in many ways throughout the state, but we also recognize that we want to play a role as a community leader. And so Brewers Community Foundation, along with our community relations department, plays a huge role in facilitating that effort. So we have players involved, we have our investors involved, our front offices involved. And I always like to say we're basically 100% giving organization. We ask for money from the players, we ask for their time, we involve their families, we do volunteerism from the front office every single month. So we just have a little machine that we continue to grow because, you know, in the end, we love Milwaukee. We think it's a wonderful place, and we want to make sure that whatever we can do with the resources that we have, that we can play a role.
Absolutely. So how do you direct the funds that you distribute or the programming that you do? And one other question that's kind of a pet interest of mine is I grew up in La Crosse and we would drive the 3 hours back when it was County Stadium. It became much easier to plan that trip once there was a roof and we knew the game would happen. But I also think there's some interesting statistic about the Brewers fan base, which is that most people at a game come like 75 or 80 miles. So is the scope of the foundation just Milwaukee, greater Milwaukee, which I understand also makes sense because of relationships with the tax base and all kinds of things? Or do you look a little bit beyond Milwaukee? So kind of where do the funds actually go and does that go beyond Milwaukee?
Well, first, let me tell you where the funds come from. So when I'm in spring training, I'm meeting with every single player and I'm asking them for a financial contribution. That kind of kicks off the season. When I go back, I'll be meeting with our investor group and I'll be asking them for money because we want to make sure that our players and our leadership and then front office are involved in this fundraising strategy. From there, we work with our fans and we do a 50-50 raffle that generates a significant amount of money that is a part of the pot that we use to do grant making. So primarily we focus on the 5 counties in the greater Milwaukee area, but we also do funding across the state. It's not as robust as you might understand. There's so much need across the state that it's really challenging. And I think this is where I always chuckle when people say, oh, I'd love to give away money. It's so easy. And it's like, no, you never have enough money to give away. But one of the things we just did back in January is we went to visit 5 cities in the state and we did a frozen sausage tour.
Okay.
Sausages out.
I saw that.
Yeah, and we identified teachers in each one of those communities and provided a small grant and started a new relationship with that school and that community. So our hope is to spread the wealth a little bit but do it in a way that makes sense, that we can manage and maintain and not disappoint. We have done some funding though for a variety of projects throughout the state.
Sure, sure. No, that's very helpful insight, and I can completely understand the need to kind of concentrate in the region, and then yes, not totally open the doors to everything. So in terms of the core activities and funding that are happening, let's say, for example, in those 5 counties, how does that translate in the community? Is it grants to nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, we do. We focus on health, education, recreation, and basic needs. Those are our
Okay.
focus areas of interest. We have a portal where people can apply for grants. We believe that general operating support is probably the most critically needed support because so many organizations have restrictions on the
Yes.
dollars that they're able to raise. So we want to offer a flexible dollar. Our grants aren't huge, but I think they do fill a gap that's really important. Those requests come in through the portal. I have an opportunity to review the requests because I've been here for such a long time now. We have a lot of repeat grants
Mhm.
that we're doing. We have organizations that I believe we've been maintaining over a long period of time because they're providing a critical need like housing or hunger,
Yeah.
domestic violence. We do the Wisconsin Humane Society for
Mhm.
pets, and it's very broad, but I
Mhm.
do think that we're having a great impact.
Wonderful. I love that you actually are calling out that you're supporting with unrestricted operational funds because in our world of nonprofit studies and looking at the trends out there, sometimes there's almost a harmful narrative that, you shouldn't have operational costs or they should be so extremely low. But the fact of the matter is, you're right. So many organizations are piecing together restricted funds and then they really need those unrestricted funds, I guess is what I observe.
Yeah, but bottom line is you need to have your lights on. You need to hire somebody that can help facilitate the work. You might need to have some supplies in the restroom. There's some critical things that are needed. And
Yeah.
so because our average grant is around $10,000. The
Mhm.
other thing I look at is we raise money from a broad group of people. So it would be very challenging to target our funding around one thing.
Yeah.
As people come and go, as they buy raffle tickets, as our investors give money or our players, we ask what they're interested in. I happen to have a list of things that the players want to do for 2025 right now. We've got youth baseball, autism, ALS, the military, helping out kids and animals, underprivileged children. It goes on and on,
So you,
education,
yeah,
wounded warriors. So you try to meet those needs because you want your donors to see themselves in the strategy. And
yeah,
I'm pleased with what we've been able to do.
yeah, no, that's a great strategy. So that's interesting. So that when you're meeting with players at spring training or new players are coming on board, you are having those conversations about their particular interests.
Yes, I meet with each one of the players
Mhm.
one-on-one. I talk to them about the charitable arm. I talk to them about the culture of our community and the organization, how giving people are and how appreciative our fans are for their
Mhm.
involvement. And then I whip out a payroll deduction form and and I ask them for a gift. And I've been consistently getting nearly 100% giving
Oh,
because it's a story that makes sense. And I
yeah,
believe that players and their families feel like they're well cared for when they're in Milwaukee and they feel the love from the fans, so they're inclined to be supportive.
wow, that makes me even more proud of my brew crew.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned investors. Do you mind just sharing a little bit more? You've talked about the players. What is the realm of, what is the range of stakeholders that you work with, whether that's team in your office or the owners of the club or investors? I mean, just can you share a little bit more about who all you're obviously the face of the foundation, the CEO, the executive director of the foundation, but who else do you have to work with in this work?
Well, I have a staff.
Mhm.
We have our 50/50 raffle sellers and our coordinators that manage that.
Mhm.
I have a manager of the office. We have interns, but Mark Atanasio and his wife Debbie are the leadership that
Mhm.
said that they really want the charitable arm to be aggressive and
Okay.
that they know that we can do good work and they want that to happen. So it really started. And then we have an investor group that's involved with the organization. So I asked them for money too.
Mhm.
And they've been very supportive. And when I go back to Arizona, I'll be meeting with them on Saturday and I provide them with an update about how we're doing. And actually, since 2010, we've raised about $60 million.
Wow.
Last year, we raised $4.5 million. The 50/50 raffle generated more than $3 million.
Wow.
Do a drive for charity where fans bring in all kinds of supplies, peanut butter, hats, mittens, and gloves, toiletries, all kinds of things that are helpful. You know, we took the wish list from the Veterans Hospital and paid for everything on the wish list. So we're
Wow.
covering a lot of ground.
Yeah.
And you know, I've been waving this flag of 100% giving organization. And I think
Mhm.
people have pretty much bought into that
Yeah.
and have owned the fact that we're doing great work and they're proud of it.
Amazing. It must, so that's a perfect segue to my last question, which is, I think a lot of us imagine that, this is just like the dream job, you're giving out money, you're working with your favorite athletes. And I'm sure there are many, many highlights. It sounds like just from the way you've described this today that you really enjoy this work. And you mentioned that sometimes it's not all sunshine and roses because, people want to ask for money that you can't give. It's not all easy. But anything more you'd like to just share about your experience with sort of the highlights and the lowlights of this work? Like what's great about it? What makes for, a great day or a great year, and then what's difficult or a little bit more challenging about it?
Well, I'll start by saying that when I started, I didn't have any gray hair. And now I have a whole head of it. And I'm not blaming it on the job, but just saying. But I think the most challenging part, aside from just not being able to do everything, I'm a little bit of a bleeding heart, so I want to do everything. But I think the most challenging piece of this is that even when you're making contributions to support issues, we're not solving the issues.
Mhm.
And so we know that we're helping numerous people. We know we're providing scholarships for students to go to school. They're being successful, they're graduating. We know that we're providing experiences, but you don't get a chance to say, 100% of the kids are on reading level. No
Mhm.
matter how hard we spin our wheels. This
Mhm.
year, I really want to focus on that with our work
Mhm.
because we know that many kids, especially in the Milwaukee area, are not on reading level. But I also know that the dollars that we donate will not solve that problem, but we can be a part of the solution. And
Yeah.
so I think one of the challenging things is to identify what it is you want to focus on, where can you have the greatest impact, and then move forward in ways that make a difference. But for me, that's the most challenging thing. I was involved with Sojourner Family Peace Center for 11
Yeah.
years,
Sure.
focused on domestic violence. We did a lot of work. We done 2 campaigns. I'm involved with a campaign right now where we're trying to raise $20 million. Domestic violence won't go away as a result of that work. We'll be helping individuals, we'll be moving the needle, but it won't go away.
Yeah.
So that's the hardest part.
Yeah.
What makes me happy is when we are able to give, a scholarship to 100 kids because we have shared our effort with our Latino players, for example. And every dollar that they commit to Brewers Community Foundation over the last couple of years, I've been able to match. And then we provide $1,000 scholarship to about 60 kids. And we all gather and, you can just feel the excitement and the joy. Or when we build bikes for little kids, or we're reading to kids, all those kinds of things are very meaningful and, feel good. But it's a challenge. I serve on a number of boards as well, boards and committees and campaigns. And so we're working.
Absolutely.
And it's fun, but it's hard. It can be heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But I've been in this work for a while and I find it to be very rewarding.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate your commitment to the work. It is great as a fan and a Wisconsinite to see the presence of the foundation, to see the players out in the community for some of those events that you referred to. And I think, just to reflect a little bit more on the passing of such a legend, Bob Uecker was really somebody who helped, lift up that idea of the role of sports and the role of a sports team and the role of people involved in sports as connectors in community. And, it can mean a lot more than just a game, in terms of our culture and connecting people. And I love to see the work you're doing. I hope we'll stay in touch about it. Everyone we talked to on this panel, I felt like is so dedicated to their roles, which are very demanding roles as well. One thing that came up is it's not a 9 to 5.
That
So,
part is
so on that note, thank you for being such a huge part of that tradition and working so hard and giving of your personal time and energy. Cecilia Gore, we thank you.